We have made many episodes on the history of the Mongol Empire, about its creation, early successes, armies, and much more. But no empire survives the tides of history, and the fate of each is to fall. The Mongol Empire was indeed no exception. In today's documentary, we take you through the collapse of the unified Mongol Empire, as well as the fall of its successor Khanates. And while we see what went wrong for the Khans, make sure you're in good shape yourself. It's National Testicular Cancer Awareness Month in the US right now, and our sponsor Manscaped is joining this campaign for men's health. Testicular cancer is the most common form of cancer for men ages 15 to 35, and about one diagnosis per hour is made every day. Manscaped, proponents of good hygiene and presentation down there already, have teamed up with the Testicular Cancer Society to highlight a monthly self-check you can do to detect the cancer yourself while it's still easy to treat. Check it out at manscaped.com/TCS. And while you're there, there's a limited edition batch of 10,000 TCS Lawnmower 4.0s. It's a purple variant on their leading grooming product, a collector's item that won't be coming back, so grab it fast. Manscaped just donated $50,000 to TCS, and if you want to chip in to help fight testicular cancer, go to testicularcancersociety.org. And as usual, we've got a special offer. Use our code TCSKINGS to get 20% off your order and free shipping. Join the Manscaped movement, and don't forget to take care of your pair. The fall of the Mongol Empire is poorly represented in most popular discussions. Often inaccurately, it is stated that it collapsed upon the death of its founder, Genghis Khan, in 1227, and the four Khanates, the Golden Horde, Ilkhanate, Chagatai Khanate, and Yuan dynasty, emerged from this ruin. However, this is demonstrably incorrect. After Chinggis's death, the Mongol Empire remained unified for another 33 years. The successors of Chinggis remained not just surprisingly unified, but extraordinarily committed to expanding the empire. His son and successor, Ugadai Khan, truly developed the belief in Mongol world domination, and no longer were conquests undertaken based on lengthy justification, but just for the sake of conquest. Simply remaining an independent power became an act of revolt against Mongol rule, for heaven had decreed all people must submit to the rule of the Chinggisids. In Ugadai's reign, Mongol armies completed the conquest of North China, largely overran Iran and the Caucasus, and conquered the western steppes, before driving into Hungary and Poland in 1241. It was on the initiative of Ugadai and his advisors that the Mongol Empire received a proper administrative structure. Rather than leave the conquered population at the mercy of the Mongolian princes, on the influence of his advisors, Ugadai oversaw the establishment of branch secretariats across the empire, which essentially divided the empire into three large provinces. The governments of each secretariat were responsible for regular taxation, civilian governance, and reconstruction after the initial conquests, and answered to the central secretariat based in Karakoram, the head of which served as the prime minister of the empire. These secretariats were often in competition with the Mongol princes, who saw the lands of the empire as existing solely to be exploited by the Chinggisids, and acted as obstacles to the Secretariat's goals of restoration and protection of the population. Ugadai's successor, Guyuk's 2-year reign, sandwiched between regencies of imperial widows, made the 1240s a brief stagnation of the Mongol dream of conquest. But a grandson of Chinggis, named Mungke, seized power and was enthroned as Great Khan in 1251, killing a great many potential rivals to power. Mungke had despised the instability of the 1240s and launched a new effort to consolidate central authority and renew the conquests on a global level. For this, he needed to leverage the resources of the entire empire for this goal, and enacted a massive Asia-wide census to do so, through re-strengthened secretariats. The result was titanic armies simultaneously operating in China under Mungke and his brother Kublai, while another great force under his brother Hulagu pushed west to conquer the last independent powers of the Islamic world. For an observer on the ground at the end of the 1250s, there was no reason to doubt the inevitability of Mongolian success. All powers had so far failed to withstand them, and this great push seemed poised to bring an even greater swath of the world under their hegemony. Soon, all would be subject to the Grand Khan. However, Mengke's campaign against the Song dynasty became bogged down in sieges, mud and rain in Sichuan province. Disease, possibly cholera from tainted water, ran rampant among Mengke's soldiers, and in the summer of 1259, Mengke too succumbed to it. The succession was an issue once more. While none of Mengke's sons ever seemed to have been considered candidates, there is a slight indication that Mengke's youngest full brother, Arik Buke, was the closest Mengke had to an heir. Arik Buke had been left in the imperial capital of Karakorum to head the government in Mengke's absence, and in quick order, the central secretariat in Karakorum supported Arik Buke, as did Mengke's sons. Considering it had previously taken years to settle on candidates, it could be that Mengke had left instructions for Arik to become either regent or Great Khan in event of Mengke's death, to ensure a smooth transition. Soon after learning of Mengke's demise, Arik began to organize a Kurultai to have himself elected as Khan of Khans. This did not sit well with Arik's oldest surviving brother, Kublai. Kublai and Mengke had a poor relationship. Kublai's confrontations with the North China Secretariat, his pretensions to greater autonomy and perhaps even independence, had resulted in Mengke Khan removing most of Kublai's powers and executing many of Kublai's officials. Kublai was only removed from the proverbial doghouse on the eve of Mengke's final campaign against the Song dynasty. On Mengke's death in 1259, while the rest of the army withdrew to ferry the Khan's body back to Mongolia, Kublai continued to campaign. Kublai saw his window for rulership open, but needed more military victories to his name to make himself a more viable candidate. The stench of having been removed from office by Mengke may have been too great to ignore, as well as Kublai's own interest in Chinese culture, making him an uneasy choice for more traditional Mongols. Doubtless, he expected great victories against the Song dynasty would improve his standing. Expecting there to be some time before the next Kurultai was held, Kublai battled the Song until a message arrived from his wife, Chabi, in November 1259. It informed Kublai that his younger brother, Arik Buke, was planning an election for the summer of 1260 and expected Kublai's support. Reluctantly, Kublai abandoned his campaign against the Song, but did not return to Mongolia. Instead, in the first days of 1260, Kublai arrived in Kaiping in what is now Inner Mongolia. Better known by its later name of Shangdu or Xanadu, it had been constructed by Kublai in imitation of a Chinese city, and as a quasi-capital, it had previously gotten Kublai in trouble with Mengke and his ministers. It was here that in the spring of 1260, Kublai had himself declared Great Khan of the Mongol Empire. While pro-Kublai biographers, such as Marco Polo or Rashid al-Din, portrayed Arik as rebelling against Kublai, it appears in truth that Kublai had essentially usurped power. By Mongolian standards, his election was decidedly illegal. It lacked representation from the other descendants of Chinggis Khan's children, and was not done in Karakorum or Chinggis's homeland along the Onon and Kurlan rivers. Instead, it was held in Kublai's Chinese-style city close to China, and accompanied by the trappings of Chinese rulership, including Kublai giving himself a Chinese-era name. Arik Buke continued with a more traditionally styled election, held in July 1260. For the first time, the Mongol Empire had two declared Great Khans. After a summer of posturing back and forth, by the end of the year, the two brothers were at war. Though Kublai would emerge the victor, the consequences of the Toluid civil war were immense. After taking the surrender of Arik, Kublai invited the other heads of the family to come to a Kurultai to decide Arik's fate and confirm Kublai's election. None came. In the 4 years of war, the Mongol Empire had transformed. In the far west of the empire, the head of Jochi's descendants, Berke, had gone to war with Kublai's other surviving brother, Hulagu. Berke was a Muslim, and while his anger at Hulagu's sack of Baghdad played a role in the hostilities, Berke was also furious at Hulagu's occupation of the Caucasus, northern Iran and Anatolia. These were lands Berke considered as belonging to the Jochid lineage. After learning of Mungke's death and the war between his brothers, Hulagu had taken control of these lands and killed Berke's representatives there. In normal circumstances, the Great Khan would have mediated in such a dispute over lands, for such things had happened before. But due to the war between Kublai and Arik, there was no one to intervene between Berke and Hulagu. Thus they went to war in 1262, concurrent with the Toluid Civil War. By the time Kublai had overcome Arik, the Western Khanates were effectively independent powers. The Mongol Empire was irrevocably broken apart, but not into the four Khanates of popular knowledge. From the 1260s until the early 1300s, there were actually closer to 6 Khanates, ruled by the descendants of the various sons and grandsons of Chinggis Khan. Before the 1310s, the Golden Horde was 2 independent Khanates, ruled by the descendants of Jochi, the Ulus of Batu, the White Horde, and the Ulus of Orda, the Blue Horde. Additionally, the descendants of Chagatai had their Chagatai Khanate. An Ugadeid Khanate, ruled by Ugadei's grandson Kaidu, dominated both his own Ulus and the Chagataids until his death in 1301. The descendants of Kublai ruled in the Yuan dynasty in China, and the descendants of Kublai's brother Hulagu ruled over most of the Middle East in the Ilkhanate. Only in the early 1300s, with the dissolution of the Ugadeid Khanate and subjugation of the Blue Horde by Uzbek of the Golden Horde, do we arrive at the well-known 4 Khanates. Now we look at the continued history and collapse of the most prominent Khanates, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, the Yuan dynasty, and the Golden Horde. Established in the 1260s by Hulagu, the sacker of Baghdad, the Ilkhanate is perhaps one of the best understood of the Mongol Khanates, with a rich body of surviving primary source material. The greatest is the Chronicle of Rashid al-Din, an Ilkhanate vizier, who wrote the immense Jami al-Tawarik, which forms not only one of the most important sources on the Mongol Empire, but also of the Ilkhanate's history up to the early 14th century. Generally, Rashid al-Din portrayed the early Ilkhanate as a period of instability, with Khans more interested in hunting, feasting and drinking rather than governing, allowing greedy viziers and military commanders to have their way. This was punctuated with succession struggles affected by an increasingly powerful Noyad. The Noyad were the descendants of the non-Chinggisid generals who served alongside Hulagu, and had been granted lands and peoples to support themselves. They took keen interest in Khans who were kinder to their privileges. This was coupled with famines, economic woes from intense corruption and foolish policies, including a failed attempt to introduce paper money, as well as expensive periodic wars with the Ilkhanate's neighbors. To Rashid al-Din, this instability ended with the accession of Ghazan as Ilkhan in 1295. Though Rashid likely exaggerates the previous instability in order to glorify his patron Ghazan, there seems to be strong support for a redirection of the Ilkhanate. Aside from the most obvious, which was Ghazan's conversion to Islam and efforts to tie the legitimacy of the Ilkhanate to it, Ghazan oversaw economic revitalization. A major effort was directed to reducing abuses of the empire's agricultural base and farming population. From limiting the numbers of officials, clerks and Mongols who sought to provide for themselves by extraordinary demands on the population, to stamping out banditry with highway patrols. These were accompanied by monetary reforms and new silver currency, bearing not Mongolian inscriptions, but the Shahada and Ghazan's title of Padishah-i Islam. Measurements and weights throughout the Ilkhanate were ordered standardized based on those in Tabriz to facilitate trade between regions. Canals and underground waterways were built to provide water for cities and irrigation. He also forbade the practice of enticing young women into prostitution. He must have had some success, as he soon had the funds for a massive new construction project at Tabriz, including a magnificent tomb for himself. Along the Ilkhanate's borders, he concluded a peace treaty with Tokhta Khan of the Golden Horde and invaded the Mamluk Sultanate, scoring the only notable victory of the Mongol-Mamluk War near Homs in December 1299, though ultimately withdrew before the onset of summer. In 1304, Ghazan, like all good Mongol princes, died in his early 30s. During his reign, he had succeeded in killing a great many potential rivals to the throne, but produced no heirs. His brother Ul-Jeta thus succeeded him, and continued many of Ghazan's policies. Unlike him, he wavered between multiple faiths, and won no victories over the Mamluks. But with the other Khanates, he recognized the overlordship of the Great Khan in the Great Mongol Peace of 1304. So was the Pax Mongolica finally, if briefly, instated. Ul-Jeta's greatest success compared to his brother was that he actually had a son to succeed him. When Ul-Jeta died in 1316, aged 36, his 12-year-old son, Abu Sa'id, was raised to the throne under the guidance of the regent, the powerful Noyan Choban. Abu Sa'id never wavered in his faith. He was the first Ilkhan who was raised and would die a Sunni Muslim, who, unlike his father and uncle, never showed interest in Shi'ism. Choban, as described by the great scholar of the Ilkhanate Charles Melville, saw himself as a servant of the Chinggisid dynasty, albeit an exceptionally powerful one, who combined adherence to the Khans with observing Sharia law. So Choban protected the young Abu Sa'id and ensured he had a proper Islamic education, teaching him to read, write, and speak Persian and Arabic, while also versing him in the history and genealogies of the house of Chinggis Khan and the Noyad. Abu Sa'id throughout his life maintained a love of poetry and music, and after peace was reached with the Mamluks, exchanged poems with the Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad. Abu Sa'id Ilkhan's early reign was often tumultuous. Dominated by Choban Noyan, the two fought off Chagatai and Golden Horde invasions and internal rebellions, during which the young Abu Sa'id earned the epithet Ba'atar for his courage after throwing himself into battle. Despite working well together and achieving peace with the Mamluks, Abu Sa'id's desire for Choban's daughter, the beautiful Baghdad Khatun, resulted in Abu Sa'id killing almost all of Choban's family, including the great Noyan himself. After Choban's death, Abu Sa'id's sole rule was remembered as a golden age by succeeding generations. It was in this period that the famous traveller Ibn Battuta passed through the Ilkhanate, remarking that Abu Sa'id was still a beardless youth and the most beautiful of God's creatures. Yet despite no lack of effort on his part, the Khan failed to produce an heir. When it became clear that no child would form in Baghdad Khatun's belly, Abu Sa'id's eyes wandered and fell onto Dilshad Khatun. She was a daughter of Dimashq Khwaja, Baghdad Khatun's brother, who Abu Sa'id had murdered several years prior. With a new target for his affections, he began to ignore Baghdad Khatun, particularly when Dilshad Khatun became pregnant with his first child. As Baghdad Khatun's influence waned, Abu Sa'id did not realize the mistake he had made. In November 1335, when Abu Sa'id was marching north to confront a Golden Horde attack, Baghdad Khatun is alleged to have made her move. In the account of Ibn Battuta's, a man, it should be noted, who greatly enjoyed a good yarn, after one last bout of sexual intercourse, Baghdad Khatun wiped down Abu Sa'id with a poisoned handkerchief. Regardless of the veracity of Battuta's tale, as this was far from the only exaggerated story he told of women and sex, Abu Sa'id was dead, only 30 years old. This is popularly cited as the end of the Ilkhanate. With Abu Sa'id's death, the line of Hulagur became functionally extinct. Abu Sa'id's uncle, Ghazan, had pruned the lineage, and alcoholism took care of much of the rest. The fact that few Ilkhans lived past 35, with fewer and fewer heirs each generation, has led many to search for underlying causes beyond just alcohol. Scholars such as Anne Broadbridge have suggested this was a consequence of inbreeding, given the Ilkhan's preferences for marrying into the same families over generations. The combined effects of rampant alcohol abuse among both men and women and the consanguinity may explain the alarming drop-off in fertility of the Ilkhanate elite over the last decades of the 13th century. While Hulagu had produced quite the brood of little Chinggisids, at least 25 sons and daughters, by the end of the century, Ghazan only had a daughter survive childhood, while his brother Ul-Jeytu had numerous children stillborn or dying young. From his 12 wives, Ul-Jeytu only had 3 children ever reach marriageable age, Abu Sa'id and 2 daughters, one of whom still predeceased him. Abu Sa'id himself, despite considerable efforts, only succeeded in impregnating his widow, Dilshed Khatun. There were no surviving brothers, sons, or clear male figures in the line of Hulagu to head the state. Yet the explanation of Abu Sa'id's death without heir, directly causing the fall of the Ilkhanate, has been, in the opinion of scholars like Charles Melville, somewhat overstated. The image of the Ilkhanate falling without a decline, a counter to Edward Gibbon, encourages us to overlook problems which had developed. Essentially, Melville notes, a gap had widened between the military elite, the Noyad, and the Ilkhan, which accompanied a lack of respect for the Chinggisids. The death of a monarch with no clear heir was hardly a new issue in the Mongol Empire. The Kurultai system, wherein a candidate was confirmed by the princes, could supply new khans at need, with a regent heading things until this could be sorted out. The unified Mongol Empire and other khanates were ruled in this fashion at times. In the form of Baghdad Khatun, the Ilkhanate clearly had a powerful woman to step into the role. The well-connected Baghdad Khatun was described as an intimidating, intelligent, and proud woman who openly walked around with a sword strapped to her waist and greatly influenced matters of state. In the opinion of some, Abu Sa'id was bossed around by her. In a more classic Mongolian system, Baghdad Khatun would have been an obvious regent. But as Melville argues, the actions of the Khans from Ghazan onward had alienated the military elite. More or less, they must have felt disenfranchised from the government, and that the old Mongolian way of life was being abandoned. Certainly, Islamization was the most obvious demonstration of this. Ghazan and Ul-Jeytu both abandoned the traditional secret burials of Mongol Khans in favor of massive, expensive, and very public mausoleums. The Kurultai as a means of choosing the next ruler and affecting major decisions was abandoned, and even the end of the war with the Mamluks, not by conquest but by diplomacy, must have felt like a betrayal of Mongol imperial ideology. By removing their stake in government and not replacing it with a new loyalty to adhere to in the replacement system, the Ilkhans had gradually undermined the need of the Noyad to maintain Chinggisid ideology or rule. When Abu Sa'id came to the throne in 1317, he was but a 12-year-old boy. The long period of Choban's regency further reduced the Khan's authority and increased that of the military elite. Only after Choban's death in 1327 did Abu Sa'id really rule in his own right, and did so for only 8 years. His vizier, Ghiyath al-Din Muhammad, the son of the late Rashid al-Din, sought to enforce tax reforms that would have strengthened the hand of the central government towards the regional princes and their appanages. It seems to have been an ineffective measure that only angered these military princes. Per Melville's theory, the only outcome of such failed measures was only widening the gap between the Ilkhan and the military elite. On Abu Sa'id's death in November 1335, it fell to the vizier, Ghiyath al-Din Muhammad, to try and steer the ship in the face of Uzbek Khan's invasion. Only 5 days later, on December 5th, Ghiyath al-Din orchestrated the enthronement of the new Khan, a man named Arpa Khayan. Arpa was not a descendant of Hulagu, but of Hulagu's younger brother, Arik Borke. Plucked from obscurity by Ghiyath al-Din, he was chosen for his ability to lead the army, for all indication is that Arpa Khan was a man of military background, an old-school Mongol in the words of every secondary source that mentions him. Arpa was given command of the Ilkhanid army, and in winter 1335 forced Uzbek back to the Golden Horde. Arpa Khan returned triumphant, and Ghiyath al-Din had high hopes for his new protege. Arpa was a competent commander, proven in his defense of the Ilkhanate, a promising figure to rally the Mongols around. Apparently, he had little taste for court procedure or niceties, and it is unclear if he was a Muslim. One anonymous Armenian chronicler asserts Arpa was a Christian, and at the very least he was always proud of the old ways. We might wonder if Ghiyath al-Din was deliberate here too, choosing a man who would be more palatable to the Noyad due to his distaste of courtly life. In the opinion of Oleg Grabar and Sheila Blair, it was shortly after Arpa's ascension that Ghiyath al-Din ordered the commission of a great Mongol Shahnameh, a wonderfully illustrated version of the Persian national epic by Firdausi. An undertaking of massive expense, given the large and lovingly detailed artwork, it certainly indicates that the top levels of the Ilkhanid elite did not imagine they were entering into a crisis anytime soon. But Arpa Khan was not on solid footing. Abu Sa'id's widow, the pregnant Dilshad Khatun, had fled to Ali Padshah, the governor of Diyarbakir. Ali Padshah's sister, Abu Sa'id's mother, Haji Khatun, also opposed Arpa's enthronement. In an effort to shore up his legitimacy, Arpa Khan was married to Abu Sa'id's sister, Sati Bey. Commanders who had been alienated or jailed by Abu Sa'id were given expensive gifts or freed from prison. And the blame for Abu Sa'id's death was laid squarely on Baghdad Khatun, who never had the chance to assume the regency. Accused not just of poisoning Abu Sa'id, but of treason with the Golden Horde, Baghdad Khatun was executed, supposedly beaten to death by a Greek slave with a club. Arpa Khan still looked for enemies in the wrong direction. Ali Padshah rallied those unhappy with Arpa's placement as Khan, an energetic man who might reduce their privileges. Dilshad Khatun had finally given birth to Abu Sa'id's only child, a girl, but this did not stop Ali Padshah's maneuvering. At the start of 1336, Ali Padshah raised his own candidate, Musa, as Ilkhan. Supposedly a grandson of a former Ilkhan, Musa was entirely a puppet of Ali Padshah. In alliance with Haji Khatun and Sheikh Hassan Jalayir, who had once been forced to give up his wife, Baghdad Khatun, to Abu Sa'id, Ali Padshah, in the name of Musa Ilkhan, armed a revolt against Arpa Ilkhan. In April of 1336, Arpa's army was defeated in the field. He and Ghiyath al-Din Muhammad were soon captured and killed. So ended the reign of Arpa Khan, the final Ilkhan to wield any individual authority. Arpa's death can be considered the true end of the Ilkhanate, for it removed any attachment the regional commanders held to the Ilkhanid state. Ali Padshah's enthronement of Musa Khan gave all of them the realization that each too could rule through his own puppet Chinggisid if he happened to have one on hand. From 1335 until 1343, no less than 8 Ilkhans were declared by these commanders. Most are known only by their names and who controlled them. The allies who had taken down Arpa Khan immediately fought each other and appointed their own candidates. By 1338, a grandson of Choban named Hassani Küçük, Little Hassan, enthroned his grandfather's widow Sati Bey, daughter of the late Ilkhan ul Jaytur, sister of Abu Sa'id, and also the widow of Arpa Khan. For the first time, late in 1338, a Chinggisid woman became Khan. Coins were minted in her name, bearing the title of Khan. The khutbah was read in her name, and she was officially the ruler of the Ilkhanate, such as it was. But Sati Bey Khan, the only Chinggisid female Khan, held no real power, and largely was a tool through which Little Hassan maintained his power. By the middle of 1339, she was married off to the next puppet Khan, before disappearing in the 1340s. The pretext of an Ilkhanate was maintained until the 1350s, when the final puppet ruler was deposed in 1353. The new Persianized Turco-Mongolian dynasties in northwestern Iran and Iraq, the Chobanids and Jalayirids, claimed descent and legitimacy from being generals of Ilkhans, but did not take the title themselves. Eastwards, rule fell to local dynasties and warlords, while westwards, new Turkic beyliks, from the Karakayunlu to the Osmanli, rose. Chinggisid legitimacy as the basis for rule did not long outlast Abu Sa'id, and it took a surprising figure to reinstate its legitimacy in the region, Timur Ilang, or Tamerlane. Tamerlane had risen to power from the ruins of the Chagatai Khanate. This middle ulus remains the more poorly understood of the Khanates, and its history is messy, complicated, and awash with minor Khans vying for power. For most of the 13th century, the Chagatais had been dominated by Kaidu, a grandson of Ugadai Khan. The Khanate of the Ugadaids was centered around the region later known as Dzungaria in today's eastern Kazakhstan and China's northwestern Xinjiang province. Both Great Khans Ugadai and Guyuk had enjoyed the pastures of this region. But following the seizure of power by Mungke Khan in 1251, the new Great Khan had ordered a purge of the Ugadaids and Chagatiids. Most of the princes descended from Ugadai were killed, and their lands seized by the central government. Only a few minor princes survived, including the young Kaidu. Kaidu remained quiet in his isolated pastures until after Mungke's death in 1259. In the aftermath, Kaidu steadily sought to bring the former Ugadaic lands back under his control, fighting with the Chagatai Khans and backed briefly by the Golden Horde. By the 1270s, Kaidu was strong enough to not just reconstruct the Ugadaic Khanate and declare himself its Khan, but also begin to bring the disunited Chagatais under his influence. In 1282, he appointed Dua, a grandson of Chagatai, to the Chagatiid throne. Together, Dua and Kaidu provided a dangerous set of allies and would raid the Yuan Empire of Kublai Khan, even briefly arriving in the former capital of Karakoram. Their influence was great, stretching from western Mongolia to the borders of India, where Dua's sons would attack the Delhi Sultanate. Contrary to popular belief, though, there is no evidence that Kaidu ever tried to contend for the position of Great Khan. He was Khan of the Ugadaids and no friend to Kublai, but never sought to challenge Kublai for total supremacy over the Mongols. After Kaidu died of injuries sustained in battle in 1301, the Chagatai Khan Dua helped organize a peace between the Mongol Khanates, in fear that the other Khans might cooperate against him. In 1304 and 1305, the Mongols once again recognized the supremacy of the Great Khan, then Kublai's grandson, Timur Ulejitu, albeit nominally. Until the fall of the Yuan dynasty, the Western Khanates would not just continue to adhere to a fictional overlordship of the Yuan Khans, but also exchange embassies and tribute. The Khans of the Golden Horde, for instance, enjoyed revenues from lands in China which had once belonged to Jochi. With this gap in hostilities, Dua and his successors, with cooperation of the Yuan dynasty, dismantled the Ugadaic Khanate and divided its lands between them. After Dua's death in 1307, over the next 27 years, his 6 sons succeeded each other to the Chagatiid throne. The rapid successions brought instability to the Chagatiids and made the Khanate's leadership less able to respond to an emerging divide within the state. There was competition between the various sons for those who sought to remain true to nomadism and the old ways, and those influenced by Islam and the urbanized culture of the wealthy cities of Transoxania. As the Khans grew increasingly fond of this western wealth of the Khanate, the princes and lords in the eastern part of the Khanate, who remained nomadic and much less influenced by Islam, felt ever more left out of power. When the last of Dua's sons, Tamashirin, came to the Chagatiid throne in 1331, his efforts at Islamization, while also never even visiting the eastern half of the Khanate, provided the spark that set off tensions. In summer 1334, a rebellion arose in this eastern part of the Khanate against Tamashirin Khan. In quick order, Tamashirin was killed, and in the matter of succession, all hell broke loose. For 30 years, the succession had been confined to Dua's sons, but with Tamashirin dead, the position was open to all claimants. Various contenders of different lineages and different faiths fought for the throne, and were usually overthrown almost as soon as they took power. The legitimacy of the Chagatiid's Khans was eroded as more and more regional lords acted as their own rulers, at best paying nominal heed to whoever had most recently claimed the title of Khan. At various times, there were even several Khans reigning simultaneously. By 1347, in Transoxania, a non-Chinggisid Kazagan deposed the reigning Khan and began ruling through puppet Khans. In the same year, In the eastern part of the Khanate, the lords elected their own Khan, Tughluq Timur, a descendant of Dua. Now with two major rival claimants for power, 1347 becomes the usual date in scholarship for the division of the Chagatai Khanate into two realms, Transoxania in the west, sometimes still called the Chagatai Khanate, and Mughalistan east of the Sirdaya River. Both halves of the Chagatai Khanate considered themselves the true heirs of Chagatai, and referred to the other with disparaging terms. In Mughalistan in the 1350s, Tughluq Timur Khan converted to Islam, cementing the process of Islamization there. However, the sources indicate that the process of conversion of the nomads of Mughalistan continued well into the 15th and 16th centuries. After the murder of Emir Kazaghan at the end of the 1350s, Tughluq Timur Khan used this as a pretext to invade Transoxania. In two campaigns over 1360 and 1361, Tughluq Timur enforced a reunification of the Chagatai Khanate. In Transoxania, Tughluq Timur installed his son Ilyas as the regional governor before withdrawing to Mughalistan. Many tribal leaders joined Tughluq Timur while others fled, including Haji Beg, the chief of the Balas. One member of the upper echelons of the Balas did not flee, and was able to convince the conquering Tughluq Timur Khan to appoint him as head of the Balas in Haji Beg's absence. This was the first appearance of the young Timur, although you may perhaps know him better by the nicknames given to him in later life that refer to his limp, Aksak Timur in Turkish, Timur Ilan in Persian, which in English became Timur the Lame, Tamerlane. The Chagatai Khan Tughluq Timur did not enjoy his conquest, for like all good Chinggisid monarchs, he suddenly died in his early 30s in 1363. So powerful had he been though, that his descendants continued to rule in parts of Mughalistan through to the 17th century. Without his father's backing, Ilyas was driven out of Transoxania by 1365 by a coalition of forces under Kazaghan's grandson, Emir Hussein, and Timur of the Balas. Soon after, Timur and his ally Hussein were at each other's throats, a competition in which Timur emerged the victor. In 1370, the Emir Timur was master of Transoxania. So began Tamerlane's great wars of conquest and the transition from Chagatai Transoxania to Timurid. Meanwhile, the eastern Chagatiids in Mughalistan continued to rule in often rather petty minor khanates. The very last of Chagatai's descendants would only be removed from power in 1705 by another Mongol state, the non-Chinggisid Zungars. With that, we turn eastwards to Mongol rule in China. By the time of Kublai Khan's death in 1294, he had outlived his designated heir, passing it instead onto his drunken grandson, Timur-ul-Jeytu. In the almost 40 years from Kublai's death to the ascension of Turkun Timur Khan in 1333, 9 Khans were enthroned. Of them, only Timur-ul-Jeytu reigned over a decade. Rampant alcoholism and assassinations meant few Khans lived past 35. Timur-ul-Jeytu attempted to continue the policies of his grandfather, but within a year the treasury was nearly empty, almost totally spent on lavish gifts for the princes after his enthronement. He learned too of the intense corruption of the Yuan court. The quota for court and capital officials was set at 2,600 persons. In the first year of Timur-ul-Jeytu's reign, it was found to be over 10,000. A 1303 investigation led to some 18,000 clerks and officials being charged with bribery. In typical fashion, Timur-ul-Jeytu lacked the commitment to push through with charges, and most of the accused maintained their posts. While it has been common to attest the Yuan dynasty's economic failings to corruption and lavish gift-giving, of which there was no shortage of, recent studies have highlighted a greater struggle. The 14th century was the start of the Little Ice Age, a global climatic shift towards generally cooler and wetter temperatures. Those strongly affected the Asian monsoon season, which in the 14th century manifested into a general trend of intense colds and snowfall in the Eurasian steppe, droughts in North China, and unending rains and typhoons in southern China. These began to be felt in the very first years of Timur Uljeto's reign. In 1295, typhoons struck the Yangtze River Delta. The Yellow River broke its banks in multiple places and caused repeated flooding, and a dry spell from the previous years resulted in plagues of locusts that eradicated crops and continued for the rest of the decade. In Mongolia, harsher winters starved herds and forced thousands south to seek support from the Khan. These ecological problems directly tied into the Yuan's economic woes. Kublai continued the Song policy of Huang Zheng. Government provided disaster relief in the form of cash, grain, rice, animals, and other supplies. It fit well into Kublai's efforts at reconstruction and relieving the burdens of the lower classes. None of Kublai's heirs dared repeal such a law, for it was the basis of Yuan legitimacy. However, in a century of unprecedented climatic disasters over a vast geographic area, this was an impossible burden. The detailed Chinese records and the Yuan Shi reveal a dynasty facing yearly crises. From 1272 until 1357, there was a major famine somewhere in China almost every other year. Over 56 earthquakes were recorded. Super typhoons on the southern coast coincided with super snowstorms in the steppe. Exceptionally cold winters and unexpected frosts meant certain crops could no longer be grown in the north. The densely populated Yangtze River Delta, home to one of the most economically and agriculturally vital areas of the empire, suffered annual droughts, flooding, epidemics, starvation, and typhoons, which destroyed towns and farmland, causing thousands more to die in the ensuing famines. In 1301 alone, a spring drought in the Yangtze Delta was followed by a massive typhoon. Arable farmland was destroyed for 50 kilometers along the coastline, and a 40-meter high wave pushed 280 kilometers inland. 17,000 were killed during the storm, and 100,000 starved in the aftermath. Only a month later, flooding displaced people in Manchuria. A freak August snowstorm killed herds in Mongolia. The imperial capital of Dadu was flooded, and a locust plague struck Hebei province. Survivors needed government relief. Grain and rice shortages caused the yuan to cover costs only with cash, and to provide more cash, more had to be printed, to the point it outstripped government revenues. Inflation was the result, and yuan paper money became ever more worthless over the 1300s. With seemingly unending waves of natural calamities and an ever more worthless currency, it seemed the yuan were losing the mandate of heaven, the right to rule China. On Timur Uljeto's death in 1307, without surviving children, factions formed around his nephews. His nephew Kaishan was a man of the steppe, with no love or understanding of Chinese culture. Hoping to rule like a nomad through his noyad, Mongol military elite, lavish gifts, princely titles, and palaces were spent on his friends and allies. 4 months into his reign, Kaishan found he spent over a year's worth of government revenue. In a panic, he spent the rest of his reign trying to address this, increasing taxes and collecting debts cancelled by Timur Uljetu. A new currency was put into circulation, based on an exchange of 1 to 5 with the old. The volume of currency printed in 1310 was 7 times higher than the previous 3 years, succeeding only in furthering inflation. On his death in 1311, he was succeeded by his brother Ayubawada. The new Khan unleashed a violent purge of his brother's officials, reversed his policies, and abolished his currency. Ayubawada wanted a more traditionally Chinese Confucian government, and reinstated the civil service examination system to choose officials. He promoted the translation of Chinese classics into Mongolian, and began the codification of the Yuan legal system. Such was the ongoing back and forth with each new Khan, with the top layer of government usually suffering a bloody overhaul and total reversal of policies with each succession. Ayubawada died in 1320, aged only 35. His son and successor, Shidibala, spent most of his reign battling Ayubawada's powerful mother, only to be assassinated in 1323. His successor, his cousin Yesun Timur, was likely involved in the plot, and after only 5 years on the throne, died in 1328 of illness, also only 35. Yersun Timur's 8-year-old son, Ragibag, was enthroned at Chengdu on the efforts of Yersun Timur's chancellor, but the plan went awry when the central capital at Dadu was seized by the head of the powerful Kipchak Guard, El Timur, who placed Prince Tugh Timur on the throne. El Timur violently seized Chengdu, and young Ragibag Khan disappeared in the chaos. Soon after, Tugh Timur's older brother, Kushila, returned from his exile in the Chagatai Khanate. In August 1329, they met in a warm reunion, Tugh Timur recognizing his brother's overlordship. 4 days later, Kushila was dead, and Tugh Timur returned to the throne. But Tugh Timur did not enjoy power for his efforts, for El Timur of the Kipchak and his ally Bayan of the Merkit held real power, reducing the Khan to a figurehead. The Khan dedicated his reign to studying Chinese classics, practicing his calligraphy, and suffering immense guilt over his brother's murder. When he died in 1332, he had declared his brother's son, Iringibal, as his heir in place of his own minor son. An aging and ill El Timur reluctantly agreed, and the 6-year-old Iringibal was duly enthroned as Great Khan, only to die 2 months later. The court pressured El Timur to recall Iringibal's exiled older half-brother, Toghon Timur, though not before El Timur married his daughter to him. Toghon Timur was the longest reigning Yuan sovereign after Kublai, ruling from 1333 until his death in 1370. At first, he, like his predecessors, was a puppet. On El Timur's death, his ally Bayan took his place. He desired restoration to an imagined good old days under Kublai and sought to enforce separations between Mongols and Chinese, which had blurred over previous decades. Chinese were banned from many government offices, forbidden from learning Mongolian and other West Asian languages, the civil service examinations were cancelled, the general population disarmed, and their horses were confiscated. Yet Bayan also wanted to make the government more efficient by cutting court expenditures and reducing stress on the empire's population by decreasing the high fees on the salt monopoly, encouraging agriculture, and improving and speeding up the government relief system. All his efforts were, of course, signed off by the young Toghon Timur, who lived in fear of him. Bayan's centralization of power and willingness to respond to rumors of threats with great violence galvanized resistance to him, including by his own nephew Togto. In spring 1340, Togto and Toghon Timur exiled Bayan, who died a month later. With him went the last of those who wanted to go back to the old ways, succeeded by those who recognized and even celebrated the Sinicization of the Mongol dynasty. The new generation of court leadership was symbolized by Togto. Only 26 years old at Bayan's ouster, Togto was well educated and raised to prominence by his uncle. Unlike Bayan, Togto had no misconceptions about restoring things to Kublai's time. To Togto, Chinese culture and Confucianism were to be appreciated. Believing all dynastic problems could be solved with a steady hand and powerful government, Togto sought to centralize and strengthen the Yuan with a variety of reforms. His first period as chancellor saw the removal of the last of Bayan's allies, the restoration of the civil service examinations, greater incorporation of Confucian scholars into government than ever before, and actual visibility to Toghon Timur Khan. The Khan's family gave a decree denouncing his uncle Tugh Timur for murdering Kushila and had Tugh Timur's surviving son executed. Toghon Timur's own son, Ayushiridara, was entrusted to Togto to be raised and educated, and Togto put great energy into molding the boy into an ideal Confucianized Mongol ruler. Throughout this political upheaval, the environmental crises only worsened. The flight of the Mongols and other peoples of the northwest grew so bad that in 1323, 39% of the money printed was spent on trying to send the refugees back with aid, before ultimately forbidding anyone from leaving Mongolia on pain of death. Intense flooding every year of the 1320s annihilated croplands, and inflation only continued to rise, and the population grew ever more agitated. Over Tugh Timur's 3-year reign, 21 rebellions broke out. no new revenues could be found to pay for these expenditures, while the costs of relief, war, the court and corruption continued to soar alongside inflation. While Chancellor Tokto imagined carrying out great works to dazzle his contemporaries, his plans were cut short by the environment. This was a decade of annual earthquakes, unseasonal snowstorms eradicating entire herds, severe flooding, widespread famine, drought and epidemic, including, in the opinion of some scholars, the start of the bubonic plague. For the general population, the field of frustration finally began to bloom into violent uprisings in the 1340s. In 1341, there were over 300 bandit uprisings across central China, including the Red Turban movement. So called for their red headbands, this was a number of loosely connected groups which espoused a radical Confucianism, calling for a drastic change of society through military means to return to an older, purer China. Tokto resigned his position in 1344, allowed his successor to take the blame, then returned triumphant in 1349 when recalled by the court. As by then Togon Timur Khan had grown bored of governing, Tokto was now the dominant figure of the Yuan realm. Tokto ordered the printing of great sums of money to tackle his greatest scheme, forcing back the Yellow River to once more enter the sea south of the Shandong Peninsula. Back in 1344, 20 days of non-stop rain caused the river to break its banks and flood numerous districts and cities, cutting off the Grand Canal and draining into the Huai River, which caused it to rise and threaten the salt fields in Shandong and Hebei provinces, all before settling into a course north of the Shandong Peninsula. The threat to the salt fields was a particular concern, as the salt trade and its taxes provided 6/10 of Yuan yearly revenue, while the Grand Canal needed to be kept open to transport rice and grain north to feed the capital of Dadu. There was intense opposition to the project to reroute the Yellow River, but Tokto forced the plan through, printing 2 million ingots worth of new currency to pay for it. From May to December 1351, 150,000 laborers and 20,000 soldiers dug a 140-kilometer-long channel to successfully reroute the river. Once more the Grand Canal was fed, the salt fields were protected, and the Yellow River exited into the sea south of Shandong. Tokto's project was designed to protect the producers and economy of the Yuan dynasty, but it accidentally sparked off its ultimate collapse. The large gathering of workers, hungry and weak from years of famine, punished by cruel overseers trying to meet a strict timetable, and paid in money only a little above worthless, was fertile soil for the Red Turbans. Even as work continued on the canal, a massive revolt erupted in the Huai River Valley. The Yuan were taken by surprise, and a number of cities fell in quick succession, with few city walls having been rebuilt after the initial conquest. In the first engagements, the government forces were poorly prepared and beaten back, including an army commanded by Tokto's brother. These were not the highly mobile horse archers of the conquest, but generally local Chinese militias commanded by Mongols and Central Asians. But Chancellor Tokto was custom-made for this emergency. He immediately organized the defense, raised new armies, and conscripted militias. New training and command structures were implemented. He knew he had to tread carefully, lest mismanaged and underpaid troops join in the revolts. In a dizzying juggling effort, Tokto constantly shuffled larger military units, transferring and reappointing commanders around the empire to prevent them from forming alternate power bases. The Yellow Army, mostly Chinese volunteers under Mongol and Turkic commanders in yellow uniforms, became Tokto's nationwide apparatus of pacification, as termed by historian John Dardis. Leading the most important campaigns himself, Tokto began to halt, then push back, and finally overrun the rebellion. By the end of 1352, Tokto had brought the Huai River Valley back under control. Methodically, they retook cities, and by the end of 1354, Tokto was about to crush the final major figure of a largely broken movement, Jiang Shicheng, now isolated in his capital at Gaoyu. And at the last moment, Togon Timur Khan snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. For unclear reasons, the Khan ordered Togto dismissed at the start of 1355. A short-sighted and inept monarch, perhaps fearful of Togto's growing might, yet at the same time unable to replace him, Togon Timur ensured that Togto's carefully balanced military machine collapsed instantly, much of the army deserting, and the Red Turban Rebellion exploded with new vigor. Togto, a loyal servant to the end, accepted his dismissal and was assassinated the following year. Togon Timur sat almost idle as the Red Turban warlords fought for the right to succeed the Yuan. After the Battle of Lake Poyang, this was Zhu Yuanzhang, who soon declared the Ming dynasty. Togon Timur had little power over his remaining commanders, who fought each other as much as the Red Turbans. By the end of the summer of 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang, now enthroned as the Hongwu Emperor, sent his trusted general Shu Da to take Dadu. Togon Timur and his heir Ayashiridara fled to Mongolia only days before the arrival of the Ming armies, and on the 20th of September 1368, Dadu came into Chinese rule for the first time in over 400 years. The Hongwu Emperor renamed the city to Beiping, meaning pacified north. In time, the city became the capital of the Ming dynasty and was renamed to Beijing, the name it holds today. Aside from a few Yuan loyalists who held out for another 20-odd years, Mongol rule in China ended in 1368. The Yuan dynasty, contrary to common depictions, had responded vigorously to a dramatic climatic emergency, but could not overcome such a massive crisis. Few states, though, could have survived such a threat, while simultaneously suffering rampant political and economic turmoil that was continually compounded by the environmental crisis. In this respect, it remains impressive that the successors of Kublai Khan lasted even 70 years. Even after their flight to Mongolia, the descendants of Togon Timur Khan continued to claim they were the legitimate rulers of China, and that the Yuan dynasty in fact was continuing unabated, though for historians this state is known as the Northern Yuan. However, by the start of the 15th century, the Yuan Khans, even in Mongolia, were reduced to puppets by the rise of the Oirats, whose leaders were not descendants of Genghis Khan. Throughout the 1400s, Mongolia was ruled by the Oirats, who maintained Chinggisid figureheads. Some of these figures were quite powerful and launched vicious assaults on the Ming dynasty. In 1449, the Oirat leader Esen Taishi captured the Ming emperor in battle and laid siege to Beijing. The Ming survived the crisis, but their fear of the Mongols was renewed, which prompted the expansion and construction of the Great Wall of China as we know it today. In the 1500s, a descendant of Genghis Khan named Dayan Khan succeeded in reuniting Mongolia under Chinggisid leadership, and so it would remain until the mid-1600s, when both Mongolia and Ming China were conquered by a new power, the Manchus, who would establish the final imperial dynasty to rule over China, the Great Qing. Having now covered the other Mongol states, we now turn to the far west, to the Ulus of Jochi, the Golden Horde. After Mongol rule was firmly established over the western steppes and Rus principalities by the 1240s, the successors of Batu were unassailable. While sometimes presented as outside or even independent of the Golden Horde, the Rus principalities were the Khan's total vassals, providing tax, tribute and soldiers as the Khan required, and each Rus prince had to receive confirmation for his right to rule from the Khan's Yalik. Firmly supported by both the Rus princes and the Orthodox Church, after the 1250s there was minimal resistance to Mongol authority in the Rus lands. Yet the Rus were but one of the subjects of the Jochid Khan, and not where his attention was most directed, for they continued to live as nomads. Mongol rule reorganized society in the steppes. They brutally enforced a new organization, where all the peoples of the steppe were divided into uluses or patrimonial peoples. Grouped into units of 1,000 and further subdivided, all of these uluses were allotted to the new Mongol elite, the Alten Urag, the princes of the line of Genghis Khan, and the Noyad, the military leadership. Each ulus was given its own grazing grounds and natural resources. Transfer between units was forbidden, and they were forbidden to use another ulus's resources. The revenues from the uluses, in the form of the products of their herds, went to the Jochid Khans. In this way, the Mongol rule over the steppe was maintained, and the Chinggisid elite spread amongst the Turkic population. It proved a remarkably effective system for maintaining stability and preventing native rebellion. The Jochid Khan in this way could keep track of his manpower and resources of the Khanate, and trade could travel easier without fear of being raided by a Kipchak chief. Another byproduct was the steady growth in the population of the steppe and the Rus principalities. Under Jochid rule, numerous settlements were established. Over 100 are known archaeologically and from written sources. While many of these must have been initially quite humble, and the capital of Sarai at its inception perhaps just thousands of felt tents, gurs, as the population grew, nomadic encampments turned into permanent cities, with rectangular districts of suburbs and craftsmen emanating from central squares. The archaeological remains of the largest of these, Sarai al-Jadid, stretches for 7 kilometers along the Aktuba River, and at its height in the mid-14th century may have held some 75,000 people. The 13th century was a climatic optimum in the steppe, of warm and wet temperatures. Political stability allowed an expansion in agricultural production to supply these massive cities. In addition to the millions of sheep, goats, cattle and horses the nomads supplied cities with, so too were more lands cultivated. Various kinds of wheat and millet were extensively cultivated in the Ukrainian steppes, and the Golden Horde was a primary regional exporter. Slaves and horses were also important exports for the Jochid state. The excellence of the Jochid horses saw many thousands sold yearly from the Rus to India. The Golden Horde was further enriched by great overland trade. Wares from China and Egypt are found in the remains of Horde cities, and industries within these cities developed around supporting and providing for the merchants who led this caravan trade across the Mongol Khanates. Jochid Khans encouraged trade through low customs duties and transplanting Rus and Kipchaps to rivers to permanently man ferry crossings. The Golden Horde's golden age was reached in the first half of the 14th century, during the 30-year reign of Khan Özbek. In the final years of his life, the good fortune of the Jochid Khanate began to ebb. Environmental data indicates a steady decrease in precipitation in the steppe beginning in 1280 and dropping precipitously after 1320. In already dry steppe grasslands, this led to less productive pastures and desertification. For an economy and population that still relied on their great herds of livestock, an upset to the steppe biome pushed many into destitution, and they sought shelter in the Horde's great cities. Further woes came as the Caspian Sea rose. The Italian geographer Marino Sanuto wrote in 1320 that it rose by a hand's breadth every year. Low-lying farmland and communities in the Volga Delta were destroyed, driving yet more people to the cities. The disintegration of the Ilkhanate and the Chagatai Khanate in the 1330s unraveled the overland trade which had helped enrich the Jochid cities. The greatest disaster came just after Özbek's death, when the Black Death struck. Overpopulated and undersupplied cities were ravaged. In Crimea, one source speaks of 85,000 dying of plague there. It was there in 1343 that Özbek's son, Janibeg, while besieging Kaffa, infamously is alleged to have thrown plague bodies into the city, which brought it to Europe. Rounds of plague would strike repeatedly for the remainder of the Horde's history. The nomadic population suffered less than the urban, while the steppe itself could act as a barrier. The plague only came to the Rus lands in the 1350s, from contacts with Europe rather than the Horde. On Janibeg Khan's death in 1357, the dynasty's luck ran out. In quick succession, his sons killed each other, and by the start of the 1360s, the line of Batu was extinguished. The door was opened for any claimant descended from Jochi. During the next 20 years, over 25 men claimed the throne. Some are only known from coinage minted in their name. Some ruled little more than weeks, until pushed out by another contender or power broker. Of these, the most famous was the general Mamai, who from his base in Crimea became the most powerful individual kingmaker. While the Jochids wasted their energies in 2 decades of anarchy, its hold over the border regions weakened. Lithuania seized the far west, taking Kiev and pushing to the Black Sea coast. The eastern wing of the Ulus became independent. In the Rus lands, princes stopped making the treks to the horde for confirmation. The Rus princes grew bolder, and the Prince of Moscow, previously the Khan's favorite tax collector, grew in might, culminating in Prince Dmitri's victory over Mamai at Kulikovo in 1380, when Mamai came to chastise Dmitri for his failures to provide tribute. Shortly after, Toktamish, a descendant of Jochi's son, Tuka Timur, succeeded in overcoming Mamai and the other Khan makers and re-established central authority. Angered at the Rus prince's tardiness with in-person submissions and tribute, Toktamish took his army into the Rus lands, sacking Moscow in 1382 and sending Dmitry Donskoy fleeing. The Battle of Kulikovo, despite its standing in Russian popular memory, did not alter the dynamic between the Rus and the Horde. Yet Dmitri's policies over his reign solidified Moscow as one of the most preeminent cities of the Rus. On his death in 1389, his son was accepted as Grand Prince with little issue, though the Rus were still vassals of the Khan. Toktamish enacted reforms to strengthen his power, combat inflation, and reset the Horde's diplomacy. To the Mamluks, Ottomans, Jilayirids and Mogulistan, he renewed friendly relations, while in the west made Lithuania and Moldova vassals of the Horde. His vision was a renewal of the preeminence of the Golden Horde. Not only did he seek to revive the overland trade routes, which had further been undone by the fall of the Yuan, but he also presented himself as the heir to Chinggis Khan. His pretensions put him on a collision course with the master of Central Asia and his former ally, the great conqueror Aksak Timur, Tamerlane. Toktamish wanted Khwarezm and the Caucasus back under Jochid suzerainty. Tamerlane desired both. The two great generals went to war in 1391 and 1395, and narrowly was Tamerlane the victor. Over 1395, Tamerlane systematically sacked the major cities of the Horde. The distraction ensured the near-total dismantling of the urban economy and overland trade through the steppe. After Tamerlane's withdrawal, Toktamish and his sons could not overcome the Horde's new master, Edigur. As he was not a descendant of Chinggis Khan, Edigur could not become Khan, but as Beylerbey, empowered by Tamerlane, he controlled the succession. For the next 2 decades, he reduced the Khans to puppets, removing those who challenged him, and had some success in strengthening the Horde, even retaking Khwarezm after Tamerlane's death, and besieging Moscow in 1408. Some economic recovery is indicated from the restarting of mints in major cities. To help legitimize himself, he also furthered conversion to Islam of the Horde's nomadic population, continuing the process begun by Uzbek. But Edigur's power was never secure. Rival factions put up their own Khans, and the sons of the late Toktamish continued to fight him. In 1419, Edigur was finally killed by one who had been declared Khan, and with him died the final figure who had the capability of holding together the Horde's constituent parts. The 1420s saw another decade of Khans who ruled only briefly, and often at the same time. The situation stabilized slightly over the 1430s and 40s into 3 main powers: Abul Khair Khan in the east, Kuchuk Muhammad in the Volga steppe, and Sayyid Ahmed west of the Don River. Kuchuk Muhammad's nearly 20-year reign is when scholarship and the Rus sources call the state the Great Horde. The Rus, who spent most of these years locked in their civil wars, still paid tribute to the Khan of the Great Horde. Each Khan saw himself as the legitimate ruler, and new claimants continued to arise. One Khan, Ulugh Muhammad, made himself independent at Kazan after being ousted from Sarai. On the Ural River emerged the Nogai Horde under the descendants of Edigur. When Kuchuk Muhammad's son Mahmud was ousted by his brother, Mahmud's heirs took over Astrakhan. And in 1442, Crimea and the surrounding steppes came under the rule of Sayyid Ahmad's nephew Haji Giray, establishing Crimea's long-ruling Giray dynasty. Haji Giray and his son Mengli Giray dedicated their lives to fighting the heirs of Kuchuk Muhammad, the Khans of the ever-declining Great Horde. In a 20-year struggle, Kuchuk Muhammad's son, Ahmed Khan, enjoyed few successes, over-relying on useless Polish allies and denied tribute by the Russian Grand Princes. Ivan III continued the domination of Moscow over the other principalities and, like his predecessors, recognized the overlordship of the Khan, though maintained diplomacy with the other emerging Khans. From the 1440s onwards, Rus' tribute to the Horde lagged, and in 1471, Ivan ceased it altogether. Ahmed Khan frequently sent messengers demanding its resumption, or for Ivan to come and reaffirm his submission in person. The ever more frustrated Ahmed Khan, who had aborted a march on Moscow in 1472, ordered another attack in 1480, in cooperation with his Polish ally Casimir IV. Ivan marched against him, and the armies faced off across the Ugra River over the summer and into the autumn. Ahmed waited in vain for Casimir, who never arrived. Arrows were shot, arquebuses were fired. Ivan worried the river would freeze and allow Ahmed free passage. Ahmed retreated first, downtrodden his ally had failed to show, and was murdered the next year. So ended the great stand on the Ugra River, a glorified staring contest. Only centuries later did Rus chronicles see it as marking the independence of the Rus. It did not directly affect either party's standing. 20 years later, Ivan sent a message to Ahmad's son and successor, Sheikh Ahmed Khan, inquiring about resuming their earlier relationship in the midst of a fierce round of struggle with Lithuania, while tribute under different names would continue to the Crimean Khans. After Ahmed Khan's death, his sons attempted to act as co-rulers, but were soon at each other's throats. Sheikh Ahmed emerged the victor, with futile dreams of reuniting the Horde. His cousin in Astrakhan defied him. Ivan III of Moscow allied with Mengli Giray of Crimea against him. Efforts to bring Lithuania into a military alliance failed. Rounds of plague and bad seasons brought further misery. Harsh winters and poor grazing killed thousands of livestock every year of the 1490s. Famine weakened his forces, destroyed his herds, and caused thousands to flee to neighboring khanates. Sheikh Ahmed led his underfed and weakened army in one last gamble, seeking to push west of the Dnieper for greener pasture in winter 1501. Trapped by a vicious snowstorm, his demoralized army suffered for months, and many deserted to Mengli Giray. Already depressed from the failure of the Lithuanians to arrive, Sheikh Ahmed watched the last of his brothers fall ill and die. As Mengli Giray summoned the entirety of his forces, the last of Sheikh Ahmed's will broke, when his own wife abandoned him with much of his family and remaining troops. When Mengli Giray met Sheikh Ahmed near the Dnieper in June 1502, the Khan of the Great Horde was caught with a paltry 20,000 men. Chased from the field, his ordu looted, Sheikh Ahmed Khan spent most of the next 20 years in Lithuania as a political prisoner. So, according to traditional scholarship, did the humiliating career of the final Khan of the Golden Horde end. Historians like Leslie Collins have demonstrated, though, how Mengli Giray began to style himself as Great Khan of the Great Horde, a claim recognized in diplomacy by his Ottoman overlord, the Rus, the Poles, and Lithuanians. It seems to contemporaries the Great Horde did not end in 1502. The throne was simply taken by another branch of the dynasty, as had been done dozens of times before, only now based in Crimea. The power of the Giray Khans grew considerably, and by the 1520s, Mengli's son, Mehmed, raised candidates onto the thrones of Kazan and Astrakhan. The brief rise was cut short by Mehmed's death by Nogais, launching a succession struggle that led to the Ottomans taking greater control over the Crimean succession. Meanwhile, the alliance with Moscow frayed, and the princes of Moscow, particularly Ivan IV and his crusade-minded advisors, were now masters of the Rus and were eager to gain access to the Volga trade, taking advantage of the weakness of the Volga Khanates. In 1552, The first Khanate, Kazan, fell to Ivan's armies. Astrakhan followed in 1554. The powerful Crimean Khan Devlet I Giray sought to halt Moscow's expansion with yearly raids, and in 1571 even succeeded in capturing and burning down Moscow, but this was followed by a humiliating defeat the next year. The Crimean Khans reluctantly ceded control of the former Golden Horde to Moscow, which soon stretched deep into Siberia. Over a century of continuous warfare had left the Russians nothing but depopulated, weakened Khanates to pick off one by one. Only to the south did the Crimean Khan's armies stop Russian expansion. Not until 1783 was the Khanate finally annexed, thus ending the last vestige of the Golden Horde and the Mongol Empire.